Welcome to the SDA Housing Podcast, brought to you by NDIS Property Australia. Before starting this episode, we need to provide a general disclaimer. Information contained in this podcast is general in nature only. It does not take into account the objectives, financial situation, or needs of any particular person. You need to consider your financial situation and needs before making any decisions based on the information in this podcast. And you should consider seeking independent and professional advice for your personal circumstances. All right, let's begin.
Hi everyone, I'm Dhanika, and you're listening to the SDA Housing Podcast, a show that explains, highlights, guides, and brings awareness about all things SDA in this ever-changing NDIS world. Today I'm here to talk about the Royal Commission into Violence, Abuse, Neglect and Exploitation of People with Disability. In particular, I'll be touching on Volume 1 of their final report, Voices of People with Disability. More than 9,000 people with disability, their families, friends, supporters, advocates and others shared their experiences and recommendations with the Royal Commission, and many gave consent for their accounts to be published as short de-identified narratives that capture the authentic voices of people with disability and provide insight into their daily lives. I'll be going over just a few of these narratives and reading them to you here today. The purpose of these is to give a voice to people with disability and to help the public better understand the issues that people with disability may encounter. We, along with the Commission, hope they will assist to bring about transformative change to help make our society safer and more inclusive for people with disability. Please be advised that content is quite sensitive in nature, as these stories are about violence, abuse, neglect, and exploitation. They may include reference to suicide or self-harming behavior. They may contain graphic descriptions and strong language and may be distressing. Some narratives may be about First Nations people who have passed away. Without further ado, here are just a few of their stories. Steve, Rebecca, and Val. 4 years ago, without warning, Steve didn't return home from his regular day program. Val, Steve's guardian, was frantic. After about 4 hours, she discovered a government caseworker had taken Steve to live in a home an hour's drive away. Steve, in his early 30s, has a cognitive disability, obsessive-compulsive disorder, and schizophrenia. Rebecca is Steve's advocate. She told the Royal Commission Val was deeply distressed because she realized how frightened and upset Steve would be at not going home. Steve had come to live with Val when he was a boy and thinks of her as his mother. Val taught him how to care for himself and interact with others. He went to school and was part of the community. He swam regularly, sang in a choir, and played sport at state and national levels. Val helped Steve save to cover the cost of competition. He had thousands of dollars in his account. Rebecca said Val was getting older and realized Steve would need to transition to independent supported living. She included the public guardian as a joint guardian, and every few weeks, Steve stayed overnight at a residential care facility. Val was not expecting the public guardian to remove him so suddenly, with no consultation or notice. She was so distraught she was hospitalized. Steve too was in shock. He was totally bewildered and grieving for Val. The public guardian removed him from his social network and his swimming and sporting groups. Anything or anyone that was familiar to him, Rebecca said. Val phoned Steve at the home every night to settle him. If he was too distressed, the support workers would ring Val, sometimes late at night, and ask her to come to try and settle him down, Rebecca said. One time, he was so distraught, the support workers took him to hospital with his wrists handcuffed. Rebecca said Val was horrified to see this young man, who in her home was gentle and responsive, had been handcuffed, feet and wrists, and had 2 armed guards standing over him. Val gently told Steve to stop struggling and sit quietly and behave himself, which he did. At home, Steve's health suffered. He rarely ate fruit or vegetables and was constipated. He slept on a mattress on the floor. He repeatedly said he wanted to go home, but was ignored. When support workers told Val there was no money left in Steve's account, Rebecca contacted the public guardian and threatened to go to the media unless something was done immediately. The guardian relocated Steve to a house closer to Val and his community supports. This was a great relief, Rebecca said. However, Steve's mental health continued to deteriorate, and he began to self-harm. Support workers said they couldn't stop him. His personal hygiene, oral health, and appearance declined. Support workers insisted they couldn't force him to clean his teeth. Rebecca said he was being restrained with medication. His exercise regime ceased and his social life was restricted. Val asked if she could be involved in his care, but this was refused. Initially, Steve was able to have dinner at Val's home one night a week, but this was stopped. He wasn't allowed to spend Christmas or Easter at home. Rebecca complained repeatedly to various authorities, and eventually there was an administrative tribunal hearing. The tribunal found Steve's removal was unlawful and the restrictions placed on his movements were also unlawful. Not only was Steve removed, but he has been denied his liberty for 4 years, Rebecca said. There has been constant negligence in the way Steve's care has been undertaken, and almost total lack of accountability by the government and those entrusted with his care. Stan and Tyrell. One night in the early 2020s, Stan, who was in a wheelchair, tried to reach a can of Pepsi on the floor. The safety belt was too loose and he slid forward, ending up slumped over the belt. He didn't have the strength to lift himself upright. Stan died in hospital a week later. He was in his mid-30s. Tyrell had been Stan's support worker 5 years earlier. Stan had cerebral palsy, and when Tyrell worked with him, he was well supported by his service provider. Stan was in his mid-20s at the time and unwell. The provider helped him find a place to live and reconnect with his family. He had access to therapy sessions, timely doctor checkups, and easy access to available resources, Tyrell told the Royal Commission. Then, in the mid-2010s, a former employee of the provider set up her own business. She began to recruit clients and got Stan to sign a service agreement. Tyrell said she did this without consulting his next of kin. She argued Stan was capable of making his own decisions. There was nothing his old provider or the support worker who had been with him for many years could do. The woman employed her family members as support workers. Some of them were even as young as 17 years old without prior experiences, no training, no safety measures in place to deal with the complex health needs of people, Tyrell said. When Tyrell tried to visit Stan, the new support workers abused him and told him to get out of their house. The house was a total mess. Neighbors told Tyrell that Stan was using marijuana heavily, and the workers encouraged him. He failed to attend appointments and therapy sessions as the new provider considered having a fun day superseded the importance of his health. A former colleague did manage to see Stan a few times over the years and told Tyrell that Stan and his dog appeared to be malnourished. He said Stan had lost half of his body weight and his hand coordination. He appeared to be surviving on Pepsi, burgers, and chips. Stan had been totally neglected, his care rights taken away from him, deprived of his dignity, as he would wet his pants and he would sit in it for hours. He had been deprived of access to basic healthcare facilities, either by choice or by the failure to uphold their duty of care. Stan died because of neglect, Tyrell said. Left in the chair all night, the pressure of the safety belt caused internal injuries. He would have been alive if a support worker had properly restrained him onto his chair, or would have put him to bed before they went home, or would have educated him on the use of a panic button. Raya and Anissa. There is nothing worse than being a victim of sexual abuse and not being believed. Raya, Anissa's youngest child, is autistic and mostly nonverbal. A few years ago, Raya, then 6, started behaving in an over-sexualized manner. Raya communicated to Anissa that her disability support aide at school was sexually abusing her. Anissa made a complaint to the school and police. She told the Royal Commission that the school denied the allegations and wouldn't investigate. Police attempted to interview Raya without any support from Anissa or a disability support person. Anissa took Raya to a psychologist who worked with her for several months. Raya disclosed graphic details of the abuse and said the disability support aide was also sexually abusing other students. Despite this, police refused to investigate further. Anissa said police believed she was manipulating Raya into telling people she was abused. The Department of Child Protection became involved. Child Protection were clearly gunning for me and treating me like I had done something wrong, while at the same time I struggled to rehabilitate my child with zero support. All government-funded agencies fobbed off her autism. The Department of Child Protection told Anissa her story was fantastical. They accused her of being mentally ill, a drug abuser, and a child abuser with no evidence. The department removed Raya from Anissa's care. Anissa had no visitation rights and can't see her daughter until she is 18. I spend many waking hours regretting having stood my ground. There have been many times where I just want to die. Ralph, Zach, and Danny. Ralph is autistic and has intellectual disability. He is in his 30s and needs help showering, getting dressed, and crossing the road. Danny and Zach are his parents. He can't prepare a meal for himself other than every morning he has cereal for breakfast, Zach told the Royal Commission. He can put milk on cereal and put it in the microwave. He does that every day. We considered bringing him along today, but he's actually working, said Danny. So we're speaking on his behalf as his adoring parents. Ralph works for an organization that pays him an award wage for sorting documents several days a week. He taught himself to read, said Danny, but his comprehension level is pretty low. He only needed to be able to read a title. He didn't need to be able to analyze anything. Zach said Ralph's employer also pays someone to work with him and support him. With all the complications going on in Ralph's life, his employment has been, after all those years, a really stable and positive thing. After several years, Ralph saved enough to get a loan that helped him buy a share in a flat, where he lives independently. Ralph pays for most of his own housing needs, which, Danny said, costs the NDIS a whole less than supported independent living, SIL accommodation. Zach and Danny say the arrangement gives Ralph more control over his life. We're both now in our mid to late 60s. We're looking to the future for Ralph about trying to get him set up so that he can be somewhat independent from us. The NDIS funds Ralph's support workers who teach him how to care for himself. One day, Ralph's NDIS plan manager called to say his funding had run out. Like, nobody can come and see Ralph at breakfast time tomorrow because there's no funding, said Zach. All of a sudden, the supports that Ralph needed just to be able to live and function and work were being stripped out from us. When they asked why, the NDIS told Zach and Danny they cut Ralph's funding because they hadn't provided any evidence about his needs. Although Zach and Danny are Ralph's NDIS registered nominees, someone had reviewed his support plan and the NDIS cut his budget without telling them. Zach and Danny paid Ralph's support services until the NDIS restored a little bit of his funding. But there was nothing there for Ralph to really develop his own living skills or to enrich his life in any way. It was just all survival sort of level stuff. Zach said they are still trying to reinstate Ralph's full funding. We are trying to establish some sort of secure future and pathway for Ralph, which at the moment, it's a bit opaque as to what that is.
Naomi. The way clients were treated is absolutely dehumanizing. They're treated like dogs. Naomi is in her late 30s and works as a disability support worker. A couple of years ago, she was working at a home providing supports for elderly people with mental health problems. She told the Royal Commission she witnessed extensive neglect, abuse, and gross misconduct. It was horrid working with that organization. I've witnessed the use of physical restraint or forceful pushing of clients. Their practice standards are absolutely appalling. 2 residents in the home were women in their 60s with high-level personal care needs. Once, one of the women had her legs stuck in between the bed rails. Staff would just turn the TV up and sit in the lounge room and make no, she wasn't calling out. One support worker, a registered nurse, was always refusing to assist in changing a client's incontinence pads because they weren't dirty enough. If the client wanted to get up or go to the toilet, she would say, "No, do it in your pad." She also told the woman her pussy stinks and it's disgusting, and withheld food from her because she hadn't been a good girl. The woman had psychosis and would repeat the same old stories. Naomi said a lot of the staff didn't want to be there with her, even though she has the highest care needs. The woman also had epilepsy. A lot of her seizures were going unchecked. The staff weren't recognizing seizures. They didn't know what a seizure looks like. Naomi said staff at the home were poorly trained. Once she needed assistance getting a resident out of the bathroom and into bed, the staff member refused as she hadn't completed manual handling training. Nobody at this site had a background in aged care and didn't know how to use a lifter, so they would either ignore clients or place themselves at risk. Sometimes there was only one staff member on duty, particularly at night. They intentionally left clients in bed and didn't interact with them. They would sit down with their phones and they would sleep on shift. Because the clients were spending more time in bed, they put on significant amounts of weight. The other resident came from an abusive home environment and was very depressed. She would not want to get up. She didn't want to leave the house. She didn't want to shower, but staff just left her in bed and ignored her. Once Naomi heard calling out for help. I opened the bathroom door to find her alone and naked in the bathroom. I could not find the other staff member on site. The nurse had left the woman dripping wet and naked and was outside on the phone. Naomi and others reported incidents like this to the provider, but they just continued not to act. The manager blocked their complaints to a health service accreditation body. Naomi turned to the NDIS Quality and Safeguards Commission, which did absolutely nothing to assist. A couple months later, the disability service provider fired Naomi and other staff members who had spoken out. It was terminating for whistleblowing. Nasir. Nasir is from a culturally and linguistically diverse background. He is in his late 60s and has lived in Australia for nearly 20 years. He has a successful working life in the public health sector and has been a minister in his church for more than a decade. He lives with bipolar disorder. Nasir told the Royal Commission that with his daughter's help, he has found ways to manage his condition. He prays, meditates, and writes. I try to connect with people, speak to people, look outside myself, he said. There are 3 important things for a person who is mentally ill. That is sleep, exercise, and diet. Those things I look after. Nasir told the Royal Commission that in his culture and community, mental illness carries a lot of stigma. People with disability are seen as less capable and less able to contribute. That means they may be socially excluded and considered inappropriate partners for marriage. They may also have difficulty finding work. He believes it is possible to address such stigma, though it takes time. He said an important first step is to educate people so they see a person with disability as more than a label, like schizophrenic or autistic. And what I want to say is that, she is not that label, he said. He feels there are strategies that could help build understanding of people with disability and mental illness. One is to celebrate their creative achievements through exhibitions, arts, poetic exhibits, music exhibits, because there is an immense talent in those communities. Nasir spoke of the difficulties he has faced in finding adequate mental health support for bipolar disorder. He said he has been to 6 psychiatrists and 5 psychologists before he found the right person. He has had negative experiences with these professionals, 2 of whom caused him significant harm. One prescribed a medication that had negative side effects. Nasir complained to the Australian Health Practitioner Regulation Agency, but the complaint did not proceed. He feels that people with disability face significant obstacles when seeing health professionals, with their requests to change medications often ignored. As a result, they're forced to cycle through health professionals until they find one who will listen. Nasir told the Royal Commission it is wrong to frame disability as a negative. Rather, he said, it should be seen as a special ability. Matthias and Viola. Please stop over-medicating children and using security men to hold them down and block their exits and put shackles on children. As a young child, Matthias experienced visual and auditory hallucinations and tried to suicide. Viola, his mother, told the Royal Commission that doctors using the Mental Health Act admitted him to a closed hospital ward. He was locked in there with teenagers, she said. Security guards or nurse support staff guarded him 24/7. The hospital didn't let him leave his room without permission and restricted all visits. When I turned up one morning, his clothes were all askew, his bedding wet, and he had his medication dripping out of his mouth. I tried to get him out of there, but as a mother, you're absolutely powerless in that situation once the Mental Health Act takes over. Doctors diagnosed Matthias with bipolar disorder. He had to take a cocktail of antipsychotics and mood stabilizers, which made him drowsy, incoherent, moody, irritable, and confused. He also developed a motor problem with his mouth and tongue, which can be a permanent side effect of antipsychotic medication. Viola said staff regularly restrained, abused, and assaulted Matthias, even though he was only little. For example, nurses would often pull him by the arm and drag him to the ground to get him to move. During one admission, Matthias saw a teenage patient sexually assault another patient, but when Viola made a complaint, it was covered up. Over time, Matthias gathered diagnoses: autism, Tourette syndrome, epilepsy, anxiety, and psychosis. Later, he would be diagnosed with schizophrenia and intracranial hypertension. Matthias had a terrible time at his mainstream primary school. He was excluded from excursions and outings on a regular basis. He was punished for his tics. One time, he was punished for fainting because the principal thought he was attention-seeking. Another time, during drop-off, he became distressed and took off towards the road. Viola rang the principal asking for help, but they wiped their hands of it because he wasn't on the school ground. We're talking a little boy. Students bullied Matthias. When Viola made a complaint about a serious assault, the counselor told her Matthias was paranoid. When Matthias transitioned to high school, the school thought Viola was exaggerating about the support he would need, but after calling the ambulance twice in the first week, they quickly got their funding to keep him safe and supported. Matthias started attending an autism support class and things settled down, but he missed out on mainstream learning, mainstream friendships, and was excluded from excursions and outings. Matthias spent his final 2 years in the emotionally disturbed class, with children from different years and levels. He wasn't allowed to attend the Year 12 support class and no one supported him to do mainstream work. Viola said he didn't learn anything during this time. He was years ahead and now he's years behind. He says he feels stupid, he is dumb, he has no friends, and that is the damage that the education system has caused my son. Matthias, now 18, spends most of his day in bed or gaming. If we do go out and socialize, it's with headphones on because he can't cope. I think this deterioration could have been prevented if he was treated well by the mental health system and the education system. He could be a flourishing, happy, active and contributing member of his society, but I can't even get him out the front door because the world is scary. People treat you badly. That is a life script that the mental health system and education system have given him. Marcus and Rebecca. Marcus is autistic and in his teens. When he joined the NDIS several years ago, it was really the first time he'd received any funding to help with his therapies. His mum Rebecca told the Royal Commission, "We self-funded what we could up until that point. But when the NDIS insisted Marcus's support plan be agency managed, they lost all the support workers they had paid privately to train. When Marcus's behavior deteriorated and he had to move out of home, one of his new support workers suggested he share a house with Marcus under an individualized living options plan, so he could give Marcus more support. After Marcus had moved in, the support worker became controlling and started sending Marcus abusive texts. We started to learn what was exactly happening at that house while Marcus was there. Marcus was his slave. Rebecca said the worker made Marcus do every single little bit of cooking, of cleaning, toilets scrubbed, lawn mowing, vacuuming, you name it. Marcus ended up coming back to my house. He will carry that experience with him for a very long time, and it took us a very long time to even convince him to let us bring new support workers in after. Damari. When I went to homeless services that were designed by people who have experienced violence and are homeless, I was told, this program is for women and children only. So there's women and children, not so much for guys out there. Damari, early 40s, has autonomic dysfunction, postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, and post-traumatic stress disorder. Until a few years ago, he lived at home with his mother and father. He told the Royal Commission that his father physically and verbally abused him on a daily basis. Damari's mother was his carer, and he said he lost his independence and stayed at home longer than he should have. It eventually took its toll on me where I got PTSD. I started to recognize that I had to get out of there because I was seeing for the first time physical manifestations like where I was not functioning and I was having nightmares about it. A short time ago, Damari's father told him he wanted to have him locked away. He rang an ambulance and told paramedics Damari had schizophrenia. They took him to hospital, but doctors released him immediately. One of the paramedics told Damari his father was abusing him and there were people who could help. A short time later, Damari went to police and obtained an intervention order against his father. His father went to police 2 days later and accused Damari of being violent. He also told police Damari had schizophrenia. Damari believes, because of that, police thought he was making things up. Police arrested Damari and officers started referring to him as that guy who thinks he doesn't have schizophrenia. The judge was more understanding and granted him bail, but he had to stay away from his parents. Damari moved to a motel, but his only income was disability support pension, and he couldn't afford to stay. I ended up homeless for 3 months, he said. I tried to go for one of my relatives to charge my phone, and they didn't want to have anything to do with me because my father had then gone and done the smear campaign of telling the same lies to all the family, friends, and relatives. So I was basically ostracized and cut off from everyone. Eventually, he found some supported disability accommodation and was able to stay for 2 weeks. He moved to a private rental where he lived for 1.5 years, but when the owner of the property died, Damari became homeless again. He tried to get some support through victims of crime, but he was seen as the perpetrator and was unable to access their services. Damari is in the process of trying to find public housing. At the moment, I feel like I'm still stuck in survival mode. I'm taking it day to day. Cassandra, I will have to start at the very beginning because my neurologist said that my disability probably was caused through trauma, childhood trauma. Cassandra, a First Nations elder, has a physical disability, medical issues, borderline personality disorder, and lives with chronic depression. Cassandra told the Royal Commission that her mother physically and emotionally abused her. I developed a river in my mind, and when this was happening to me, I used to go in this river to block out what was happening to me, she said. To get away from her mother, she married at a young age. Her husband turned out to be violent, abusive, and had substance abuse issues. She had a complete breakdown. I couldn't even go to the letterbox to get letters out. I was so scared. Cassandra's employer gave her a relocation grant to help her leave, but her husband took the money. Around this time, her health deteriorated, and she couldn't walk far without collapsing. She was diagnosed with cancer and a neurological disorder that causes muscle wastage. Cassandra couldn't access support and felt she had no choice but to stay with her husband. I couldn't even go to the toilet. I was that bad. I was in nappies, and I was in a wheelchair. Cassandra said her husband gave her opiates and she became addicted. One time he gave her too much and she overdosed. He told the hospital she attempted to suicide. The hospital was suspicious because Cassandra had bruises on her wrists. Eventually, she got support from a domestic violence service and was able to leave. Soon after, she got an assistance dog, Jerry. He saved my life, she said. As her mobility declined, Jerry would help Cassandra pick things up. If she was cold, Jerry would put the covers on her. One time, she had passed out and Jerry alerted the neighbors. When they arrived, Jerry was sitting on Cassandra's chest. The neighbors called the ambulance, who told Cassandra if Jerry hadn't been on her chest, she would have died. About 3 years ago, Jerry became ill and died, and Cassandra applied to the NDIS for a new assistance dog. The NDIA rejected the application, saying it wasn't reasonable or necessary for her to have an assistance dog. The Discrimination Act states that an assistance dog is necessary for a person with a physical disability, and the NDIA are coming up with all this garbage. If you're deaf or if you're blind, yes, you can have a dog. So they're discriminating against me because I have a physical disability. Brigitte and Richie. Richie self-harms. He hits daily. This is a beautiful little boy with Down syndrome who had no behavioral issues before all this kicked off. He should always have had these supports in place, and he just didn't. Brigitte is autistic and has attention deficit hyperactive disorder, ADHD. She is mum to 9-year-old Richie, who is also autistic, has Down syndrome, ADHD, and post-traumatic stress disorder. A few years ago, Richie started school at his local state school. The principal told Brigitte that Richie was the first child with intellectual disability he had ever come across. After a short time, he decided Richie could only attend school once a fortnight because of his disability. The principal and teachers punished Richie for his behaviors instead of using de-escalation strategies. No one formally reported the incidents or told Brigitte what was going on. Richie started to self-harm, repeatedly banging his head on the floor. His behavior changed towards Brigitte. He'd grab my hair and try and pull me onto the ground. Brigitte discovered the principal would lock Richie in a room for most of the time he was at school. After 6 months, the principal withdrew Richie's enrollment, saying he didn't meet new school readiness indicators. When Brigitte pointed out this was contrary to school policy, he changed the policy. He effectively excluded all children with disability from the school. Around this time, Brigitte applied for NDIS funding on Richie's behalf. It took about 8 months for his plan to be approved because the NDIA lost the paperwork. The initial plan was insufficient, so Brigitte requested a review. In a phone call lasting almost 3 hours, a staff member kept telling Brigitte to lower her voice. Brigitte explained she was autistic and couldn't change the tone of her voice. She was constantly trying to lead me into saying and admitting that it was my lack of capacity as a parent leading to Richie's deficits instead of his disability. The staff member offered Brigitte parenting training. Parent support gets misconstrued as parent training. Richie's plan remained unchanged and underfunded. When Brigitte needed to have surgery, she applied to the NDIA for short-term accommodation for Richie. The process was so difficult to navigate, she ended up sending him to stay with a friend in a different state. Brigitte is now focusing on her own disability and recovery, while Richie recovers from the trauma he experienced at school. I've had to put my son on blood pressure medication to bring down his anxiety. I've put him on Ritalin as well. My son takes 4 medications a day. He didn't need any of these. He was such a happy kid. Anisha and Esme. I'm just supporting what they want as a couple. There's nothing wrong with people who have a disability to be in a relationship. Anisha, early 30s, has been in a relationship with Mitch for about 10 years. Esme, Anisha's mother, supports them very much because, why not? They attended a day program together. They have a beautiful relationship. Esme told the Royal Commission they dated for a year, and Mitch became part of our family. They have feelings. They're allowed to. About 5 years ago, Anisha wanted to move out of home and live with Mitch. Esme explored the possibility of supported independent living with the NDIS. One of the goals in Anisha and Mitch's NDIS plan was to be a couple and be supported as a couple. Anisha and Mitch found a provider who was happy to support them. They moved into a home with another friend from the day program, Kate. Anisha and Mitch started seeing a relationship psychologist who specializes in working with people with intellectual disability. For 18 months, they lived very happily together. That home felt like a home, Esme said. Then the CEO resigned. When she left, other staff just kept dropping and were leaving, and there was a big hole. When she left, other staff just kept dropping and were leaving, and there was a whole big change in the organization. Suddenly, the provider terminated the accommodation agreement and refused to help Anisha, Mitch, and Kate find somewhere else to live. Esme said it was challenging to keep them all together. It was so hard because I had to do a lot of the groundwork. Esme ended up renting a house from a family member. It took multiple meetings with CEOs and management for one provider to finally agree to provide services. About a year later, some of the senior staff left. New staff were casual, inexperienced, and the support deteriorated. I did my very best to work alongside with them so that they could understand Anisha's situation and her relationship and her needs. But staff started judging Anisha and Mitch. They manipulated Mitch to believe that it was not good for people that have a disability to have a sexual relationship. The provider refused to allow Mitch and Anisha to see the relationship psychologist. Anisha struggled with the changes and it affected her behavior. Mitch was also suffering. Eventually, the provider separated Anisha and Mitch, moving Mitch to another group home. Esme begged the CEO to keep them together, but the CEO was dismissive, saying, "They don't even have a sexual relationship, so why should they live together?" Esme contacted Mitch's guardian, the public trustee, but they sided with the provider. The provider refused to allow Anisha to visit or contact Mitch. Anisha suffered the loss of Mitch, moving away. She became very emotionally unstable. I found it really hard to explain what was happening, and then she stopped eating. The provider terminated the agreement with Anisha and Kate, and they had to move to another group home. Staff physically and verbally abused Anisha. One time, Esme found her with a broken nose and 2 black eyes. When she asked what happened, the CEO told her it was a mystery. Esme demanded to see the incident report and CCTV footage, but they refused. Esme made a complaint to the NDIS Quality and Safeguards Commission. Nothing came of it, so she found another provider. They've just housed her in a very nice homely place, and they've matched her properly with the other ladies that live there. She is in a happy place now. They are supporting their relationship. Anisha and Mitch see each other regularly. I have to advocate for my daughter and others because it's not just her that's suffering. It's a lot of other people who don't have a voice, and who's going to be a voice for them? We all matter and should feel like we belong. We should build each other up to be mighty and strong. We all have a voice and should be heard, no matter how big or small the word. We deserve fairer pay in our employment in every way. We should be paid as everyone else. We are all equal, boys and gals. We work as hard as all the others. We matter as sisters and brothers. We shouldn't be separated into special groups. We should all mingle in one bowl of soup. We want a family to love and hold, to tell our story loud and bold. We can be great mothers and fathers, and our life can paint a beautiful canvas. Our children can grow to be brave and bright, and bring much happiness and light. Yes, we are all different, but all the same. We all matter, no matter our name. We should treat each other with care, look after each other's welfare. We are all individuals with our own special touch. Help each other by loving each other much. By Jasmine Smith, September 2021. Treated fairer in employment by abolishing supportive wage.
Thank you all for listening. I do hope this brings some awareness and helps bring about real change. These stories really highlight why it's so important for the NDIS to refine its processes, and also the need for SDA housing as well. Remember to be kind and compassionate to everyone around you, and I wish you all a wonderful holiday season.
We hope you enjoyed this episode. Please make sure you are subscribed and following us so you can keep in the loop with all of our upcoming episodes. We would really appreciate it if you could leave us a 5-star rating, a written review, and to share this podcast with those that could benefit. Until next time, catch you on the next episode.